Good afternoon, everyone. For those that don't know me, my name is Stephen Kelly. I'm Chief Executive of Manufacturing Northern Ireland. You're all very welcome along this afternoon to the next session in our legal best practices alongside colleagues in Selig, the legal team based in Belfast City Centre. I'm very pleased that we have with us today Kirsten Magee, who's one of the partners with Selig. Kirsten's a professional litigator. I'm not saying that as a warning in terms of your potential questions, but just to kind of briefly touch upon her expertise. We're very, very pleased that Kirsten's decided to offer some of her time today to Manufacturing NI members and others and give the best of her insight from her years in practicing law on behalf of manufacturing businesses across Northern Ireland in this area of expertise. Kirsten, you're very welcome along. Just before we start, I just wanted to remind people that we hope that this is an active and participative session. Do use the Q&A function if you have any questions, or indeed use the chat function, and we'll gather those together. And after Kirsten's finished her presentation, we'll put some of those questions to her. Obviously, today's not about providing free legal advice. Do take the opportunity to ask the questions, but if there's something specific to your business, then we would very much recommend you pick up the phone and ring the people at Selig. But if there are things that are bugging you, that are unclear about, and would be relevant for all manufacturing businesses, then do absolutely feel free to ask those questions, and I promise you we'll get to those at the end. We are recording the session. We'll be able to share the slides from the session and a recording with everyone on our mailing list after the event. But Kirsten, thank you so much for your time today. I'll hand over to yourself to run through the presentations, and we'll come back towards the end of the session with the questions and answers. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Stephen. I was going to say good morning, but we're into the afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to present to you today. As Stephen has said, my name is Kirsten Magee. I am a partner in the litigation department at Selig. I have a pretty broad remit. Northern Ireland is a relatively small jurisdiction in the sense that we see a vast range of disputes and commercial disputes. But one of the things that I also deal with and have dealt with for the whole time I've been in practice, both in Scotland and here, is supporting businesses in the event of a fatality in the workplace. Not a pleasant experience for anyone involved, but as a business, it's something that's, hopefully will not affect you, but it's something that you have to have thought about and be prepared to act quickly and appropriately if you're unfortunate enough to have to deal with this. So there's me looking a little bit too jolly given the subject matter of the day, and that's just a little bit of blurb about Selig. Okay, so during the course of the presentation, I'm going to try and keep things as practical as possible. There will be a little bit of legislation in there, but it's just where it's necessary, and it's not going to be overly legalistic, hopefully. But what I would like to look at today, first of all, is the key issues in the immediate aftermath of an incident of this nature, what you need to be thinking about. We're going to look at the role of the health and safety executive in these circumstances and the structure and nature of their investigation. The police investigation, which is carried out concurrently with the health and safety investigation, we'll look at that. And almost invariably, a death will be the catalyst for a coronial inquest. So we'll have a quick run through of what that entails. And finally, there are inevitably going to be some form of civil proceedings arising out of a workplace fatality. So, and then obviously, as Stephen mentioned, plenty of time for questions if you have any. And if like me, I always, if I'm in the audience at one of these things, I'm never overly keen to ask the question at the time, but feel free to drop me an email afterwards if you fall into that category. So what to think about immediately? Obviously, the first thing is alert the emergency services, both the ambulance and the police. And just on a practical level, have a think about how that works in your particular circumstances in your environment. I know that there will be a variety of different businesses online today, and you just have to think about, I don't know, you might have people in a space where there's not sort of easy access to a mobile phone, for example. So just think about how you would get in touch with the emergency services very quickly if there was an incident. You also have to inform the Health and Safety Executive, HSE NI. Most of you will have someone within your organisation with a remit for health and safety, and that person is highly likely to have a point of contact within the executive. So that would be the sensible first point of contact there. If you don't have a contact, then you probably should have, and you should have that relationship ongoing. I said legal advice, speak to your solicitor. You may say, oh, well, you would say that, but I can't overemphasize how important it is to have early advice, because that the first few hours can sort of set a path for how the legal process will develop going forward. So it is important to get advice as quickly as you can. The other thing, obviously, is first aid. If there is an incident, however serious, just to make sure, I'm sure everyone has trained first aiders within their organisation, but just it's something that's quite important to look at, to make sure you have enough people so that, it doesn't matter who's on shift at a particular time, there's going to be someone there with the ability to deliver first aid before the paramedics arrive. After that sort of initial process where the emergency services have come, you then move into the sort of next phase, which is first, commencing your own internal investigation. I could speak for a whole day about the ins and outs of doing so and the reasons why it's recommended as sort of best practice to have an internal investigation. But it's something that, again, will fall within the remit of your health and safety person, whoever that may be. So it's not something that you want to be thinking about for the first time under such a high pressure scenario. So it's something worth considering before anything goes amiss. Managing the press can be important. We often have clients use press officers, PR agencies, just to manage the narrative coming out in the immediate aftermath. It can be important, again, to make sure that there's a balance between, you want to have a very human response to what is, a horrific incident to deal with, but you want to just manage the way that comes out initially in the press, and that sort of ties in quite closely with the family liaison aspect of this. I often find that clients can be a little bit reticent about their dealings with the family and the immediate aftermath of a death, because they're obviously concerned about saying the wrong thing. But it's really, really important that you have your human hat on, and that there's there is communication with the family and that they're properly supported and don't feel shut out. Pastoral care, that really extends to your other colleagues, employees. I quite regularly involved in interviewing members of staff who have been involved in or who have witnessed this type of incident, and it's really, really obvious when they have been properly supported by their employer. It's really important, and obviously from a business point of view as well. You really want to make sure that you look after your people and that they can come through and feel safe and secure after an incident of this nature. So the health and safety executive, what's their role overall? I'm sure everyone is aware of the executive. They do have they have a number of roles. They provide guidance and support to industry, but they also have an enforcement role. They enforce health and safety law at workplaces across Northern Ireland, and in that regard, they form sort of part of the overall criminal justice system in the country. They ultimately will make a recommendation one way or another to the PPS, the Public Prosecution Service regarding any sort of prosecution. Now, their recommendation is not binding on the PPS, but it certainly has weight. So it's important that your response to that investigation is carefully managed. As part of their investigation, HSE will conduct interviews that can be carried out independently by health and safety officers or in conjunction with their colleagues in PSNI. Where interviews are being conducted under caution, we would always send a solicitor along to accompany whoever's been interviewed at the time. It's a PACE interview effectively, so it's important that there's legal representation at those interviews. The plant or equipment that's involved in an incident is usually taken away for forensic examination. So it's just something to be aware of that might happen. It can be useful to make sure that you have taken some photographs to show the state that the equipment or plant is in before it goes. The bulk of the work from my perspective in dealing with the HSE is that what they tend to do is issue a really onerous information request. So they will want to see every risk assessment that's relevant to the incident. They will want to see all of your training records. And it's really helpful if those things are easily accessible and clear and the information's there. So that's something that we can support clients with, is providing a fulsome response to those information requests. There are some instances where HSE will take documentation away immediately when they attend on site for the first time, but they usually follow that up with a more fulsome request. What they can do in terms of enforcement and in the immediate aftermath, HSE may issue either a prohibition notice, which is preventing you from doing something or some process that's thought to be related to the accident, or they can issue an improvement notice that requires you to change your process or improve your procedure. So, obviously those have to be complied with, and it's important that you take advice on how best to do that. I've touched on the possibility of a prosecution, and prosecutions can sort of range in severity from a fairly minor breach of health and safety regulation right up to the most serious, which we'll touch on later, which is a prosecution for corporate manslaughter. So look, everyone wants to know about the penalties involved and what's your exposure in these situations. So this is where I have broken my rule about quoting legislation and things, but really just a quick run through, what you're sort of looking at. Failure to comply with an improvement notice or a prohibition notice. If you're prosecuted for that in one of the lower courts, then you're talking about £20,000. I talk about imprisonment there. That would relate to a sort of sole trader type business. Obviously, if it's considered sufficiently serious to be prosecuted in the higher court, then the powers in the higher courts are wider, and you're looking at more significant penalties. Similarly, a breach of Articles 4 to 7 of the Health and Safety at Work NI order, most health and safety professionals will be aware of those provisions, and they're very general duties that all employers hold to make sure that basically anyone coming to work for them or any member of the public who is impacted by the work that you do is kept safe. So it covers a whole range of activities, but again, similar sort of penalties there. More sort of nominal prosecution there, the level of penalty there for the sort of more minor breaches. So I wanted to just look at something local, case studies. Some of you might recognize this one because it was in the press, but I did want to talk to you about a manufacturing business. This isn't actually a fatality, but it's a serious injury, and it's just to give you a bit of a flavour of what that can look like. So local manufacturer was fined £16,000 for failing to ensure the safety of employees while performing maintenance tasks at an unguarded conveyor. So this is one of these situations where there is guarding in place, but it's taken away for a particular activity. So the company pleaded guilty to a single health and safety offence, which is breach of one of those articles that I mentioned. The employee was quite seriously injured while they were carrying out maintenance work. And as you'll see the information there, the guard was taken away and they were manually shoveling. He was sort of pulled into it. So basically the investigation showed that the company didn't really have a procedure in place to isolate plant machinery before carrying out maintenance. There wasn't a risk assessment dealing with this, so there wasn't a sort of control measure in place. So that was, you can see the fine, the level of fine there. Obviously, that's not a fatality. Just to, by way of comparison, the situation in England and Wales is very different. That the level of fines is much more significant. So I've just built up another manufacturing example there. 400 grand there for a forklift truck injury. So the findings there, but there was no sort of safe system of work. No one was following the measures that the firm thought were in place, and that there wasn't adequate segregation between people and vehicles in the workplace. That's a really common cause of fatal injuries. So it's really important to be across. There is a lot of guidance out there about making sure that you've got clearly zoned areas for pedestrians and vehicles. And that, goes down to sort of small telehandlers as well as larger vehicles. Okay. So the police, as I said, their investigation will overlap to an extent with the health and safety executive investigation, and their findings will feed into any recommendation made to the PPS on prosecution. Police also investigate deaths on behalf of the coroner. So they will pull together evidence and statements to go to the coroner's service for use in any coronial inquest, and we'll touch on what that involves later. And again, the police findings will feed into any prosecution for corporate manslaughter, which is the most serious charge. I just wanted to take you through what it's a pretty high bar. It's rightly so. It's very serious, but it is a pretty high bar before you fall into the realms of a prosecution for corporate manslaughter. So an organisation to which this applies is guilty of an offence if the way in which its activities are managed or organised causes a person's death and amounts to a gross breach of duty. So it's about it. That's really looking at it from the top down. It's where you say that, this death was caused by the way that the senior people manage the activities of the business. But it's not just a breach, it's a gross breach. So it's the most serious breach. So yes, you're looking at the way that management really, if they would need to be, sort of a disregard for health and safety and the way that things are done. So look, I won't go into the detail of that, but senior management, who does that cover? It's really anyone who's making decisions about, a significant part of the business, and someone who is, as a matter of fact, running the business. So it's not defined in terms of, statutory directors, or the like. It can go beyond that. So just be aware of that. Sentencing guidelines for corporate manslaughter, the kind of thing that the judge will be looking at is, how foreseeable was this? If you're in a situation where everyone looks at it and says this was an accident waiting to happen, then you're in tricky territory. How far short did the company fall? Was this isolated, or was there a pattern? Were there near misses that led up to the incident? And then how far up the organization did the problem go? In terms of mitigation, what the judge is looking at, things like, companies know a previously unblemished record, or no previous convictions, they have a good health and safety record generally. Also looking at, what happened afterwards, even where something has gone horribly wrong. The judge will have regard to whether the company has taken steps to address the issue, taking steps to make sure that, the same thing can't happen again. So, even in situations where you feel this is very problematic and something has gone terribly wrong, there are still steps that you can take to protect yourself against the most serious penalties. And look, another just practical point is if you come up with a new way to do something that's going to be safer going forward and you implement that, make sure that it's not just on paper, make sure that it is properly implemented. The police are known to sometimes sort of casually drop round at a business just before a hearing. So if you give evidence to say, oh, we do this wonderful new thing now and it's, don't worry, everything's grand. The police have been known to say, well, actually, we were round last week and, this is what we observed, and it doesn't, it doesn't look like you're actually doing what you say you're going to do. So that's just something to bear in mind on a practical level. The coronial inquests, the system here, it's pretty there's a huge backlog as a result of the legacy inquests, the troubles. So it can be very slow, pretty slow process. I had one last year, which was, 4 years after the death. So it's something that can take a long time to come to a conclusion. But really, the purpose of an inquest is to find out who died, where, when, and how the person died. It's not a criminal process. It's not about attributing blame. So it's supposed to be a fact-finding exercise, but inevitably the findings of that process can lead into a prosecution or into civil proceedings. So again, it's something that has to be very, very carefully managed to avoid, as far as possible, sort of adverse comment about the business. So within the scope of an inquest, the coroner will nominate or approve applications for individuals or organisations to be PIPs, which stands for properly interested persons. So if you're designated as a PIP, then you are allowed to participate in the inquest and be represented at the inquest and cross-examine witnesses and so on. So that's obviously the family are involved, the employer. If the death was on your site but it wasn't one of your employees, you would have a sufficient connection with the incident to be PIP. So and then the procedure, as I said, is pretty inquisitorial in theory, but can become pretty adversarial in practice, where you have, competing interests and people trying to protect their own position. They tend to take place before a coroner and with a jury. Again, a practical point, it's worth checking with your insurer or your broker whether you have cover for inquests. It's not standard across a sort of employer's liability policy, which would always cover you for the civil proceedings, but it's just worth checking because it's one of those things where it always runs. It's not going to settle in the sense that court proceedings can. It's always going to happen, and it can be fairly expensive, so worth checking the position there. The sort of final legal process tends to be the civil proceedings. So the family of the deceased will have a right of action to recover their losses if someone is liable for the death. And without being real negative, ninny, if someone goes to work and doesn't come home, obviously something has gone horribly wrong. It's very, very difficult to avoid any liability as an employer in that scenario. So look, it can be a situation where there has been negligence or a breach of one of these duties, statutory duties that we've referenced in the context of a prosecution. Civil proceedings tend to involve the need for expert evidence on both liability and quantum. In terms of quantum, there are case law on the sums that are awarded to family members when they've lost a close relative, but the other issue is future loss. So the loss of the future earnings of the person, particularly if they're a breadwinner, can be pretty substantial. Just want to refer to another case that I dealt with recently for a manufacturing business, but a slightly different angle. That this was not a death on their premises. This was a death in another country entirely, Northern Ireland, but which involved a piece of machinery that they had produced, a pneumatic roller, actually. So the deceased was employed by a local business. He was actually a Polish national and one of a number of Polish nationals employed to carry out roadworks on behalf of this company. It's a very sad story, but my client's roller was being used in the works. The driver of the roller had pulled across, sort of gone slightly up a verge to let an oncoming vehicle pass. And when he moved away, the individual wasn't aware that that they had started to move off again, wasn't looking down at paperwork, and the driver tried to get his attention, failed to get his attention, hit the brake, but for reasons that I'll come on to, the brake wasn't efficient or wasn't effective. He then put the thing into reverse, didn't work, jumped out, and the poor man was crushed by the pneumatic roller. My clients were involved because the PSNI's forensic investigator came along, and one of the things that they tend to do is try to recreate the incident after when things have been cleared. So when he was recreating the incident, he determined that there was some sort of difficulty with the brakes, because the brakes appeared not to work when he was pulling away. So the fact that he thought there might be some sort of defect in the design of the brakes set all sorts of hairs running, and meant that my client was involved as a PIP in the inquest. As it happens, once we got to the hearing, the experts all agreed that there wasn't a problem with the brakes. What in fact had caused the difficulty was that there was no hydraulic fluid in the front axle, which meant that it was a sort of hydrostatic braking system, so it wasn't able to function properly because of that. So effectively, it's a bit like suspension. Don't ask me, this is a bit like need to be a petrol head to understand this, but the wheel was not touching, so it wasn't engaging. So but regardless of the fact that the shift of the focus changed, my client was still sort of under fire, in the sense that the employer of the deceased was clearly, it was in their interest to try and deflect any criticism from them. So there was a lot of analysis of, for example, the operating manual. There was analysis of the design, in the sense that the emergency stop button was that in an accessible spot. So luckily we were able to avoid any adverse criticism there, but we were very mindful of the fact that could have led to a referral to the PPS. So the coroner, even if there hasn't been a decision to prosecute, the coroner can refer that back to PPS. That didn't happen. There was a civil claim in that case. Again, inevitably, my clients were not the main show in town there. It was directed mostly at the employer of the individual, but nevertheless, that was something that they had to deal with, and we represented them in that case. So look, that's a bit of a whistle stop tour, but key takeaways from my perspective: health and safety has to be at the forefront of everything you do, and that's throughout the organization. That's from your right from the top all the way down to your most junior employees. It has to be sort of a cultural thing that you live and breathe. It's no use just having, a load of policies in a drawer somewhere that nobody looks at and doesn't. It has to be a sort of lived thing. From my perspective, having well organized, accessible records is just so helpful. Really important to make sure that you can put your hand on the relevant documentation when you are, and you will be pressed for it under a lot of, in an intense scenario. Regular reviews of your policies and the practices that you have in place to mitigate risk. It's not a health and safety, it's a minefield that it changes regularly in terms of the both the legislation and practically on the ground, advances in technology and understanding of the best way to mitigate risk. So it's something that you have to keep coming back to, and whether you do that internally or seek external support is another question. But look, if you don't do that, excuse me, it's very clear. It's very, very clear when I come on board whether I'm dealing with an organization who has health and safety at the top of the agenda or not. We've talked about some of the financial consequences of that. Obviously, nobody wants to have the personal consequences that can come with a corporate manslaughter sort of scenario. So, and it's an unusual area of law, the fact that the directors or senior people in an organization can be held personally liable. So it's something that has to be taken seriously. And again, like a broken record, the sooner you can take advice, the better. But even by just coming along today and listening, it's a great start, just to get you thinking about it. And look, you just don't want to be reacting to something like this without having turned your mind to it at all. There we go. That is a quick rattle through. Stephen, I wonder if you have any questions for me.
Kirsten, thanks so much for that. That was a very difficult and sensitive area I dealt with in a kind of really simple, straightforward, and non-alarmist way, which is great to see. There are some questions, and I'm
Sure.
going to begin with some of my own, if you don't mind.
Of course.
And it kind of starts so that I mean, Selig are a very well respected law firm, locally owned, part of this community, and you said there at the end that it's really clear to you when you walk into businesses, those businesses that culturally really get this and are doing something about this. And I know as a commercial litigator, it's probably good for business if you get to courts, etc., etc., etc. But it's clear that you're warning people, listen, be prepared, get organized, take ownership, and ensure that this driven culturally right through the organization, and put in place systems and processes to ensure that that's been activated by all colleagues. 100%. I mean, no one goes to work expecting not to come home. No one goes to work expecting to be hurt or injured when they're at their work. But equally, nobody that runs or operates these businesses expects people to come to work and not return home, or expect people to be injured. That's right. So it's about avoiding all of that. But can I just ask you, sure, from your experience, those organizations that really get it, that are culturally and systematically set up well, how important has that been for their business and those individuals involved?
It's just, in terms of where they stand, my advice to a business when I come in, on the risk that they will be looking at, one of those more serious prosecutions that we've talked about, or whether they will be in a position to robustly defend anything that comes their way. It's just like night or day, it's clear really from speaking to both the very senior people in the organization, but probably more importantly, speaking to sort of regular Joe members of staff, because it's all very well to have a polished chief executive telling me that health and safety is front and center in my business, but that really the way that it jumps out when I'm dealing with all of the staff who have been involved in an incident, and it's very clear whether they knew what was expected of them, whether they knew where to look if they weren't sure, whether they were familiar with, or what their reaction when asked about processes, when asked about refresher training. There's a real spectrum of immediately clear to me that they know that they're told, and it's not that I'm expecting to see a huge grasp of the intricacies of the regulations. It's not that. It's just about, in terms of your organization, that someone has addressed their mind to how things should be done in a safe way, communicated that, cascaded that down the business, and that it's a two-way process. That it's not just something that's sort of put up on a notice board and then not checked in on and not refreshed, and it's an ongoing process, and it has to be lived and breathed, and it will be absolutely the difference between one of these horrible worst case scenario prosecutions and being able to hold your head up and robustly defend yourself.
And this kind of came into focus for me a couple of weeks back, that Storm Owen that we had, where very late on, like the 5 o'clock on the evening before, the Northern Ireland Executive said, we're closing all the schools, we're closing public services. This is a red alert. We are asking people to take action, and the action is please stay at home, etc., etc., etc. And that instigated a flood of calls to me, and I'm sure to others, around, well, what's the advice for employers? And so my response was to speak to somebody uh, in the health and safety executive, and they said, well, on the back of that advice, employers need to be sure that the risk assessment has been fully updated and
Yep.
takes account of the advice that's just been issued. And I went back to the employers who were in contact with me, and every one of them said, we're not going to do that in the time that's available, and be able to share that widely with our colleagues. And they took alternative action, which was to avoid people coming to work the next day.
Yeah.
But it kind of shows you that showed me at least that certain employers, or most employers, are focused on the well-being and welfare of their people, but also understood that actually this isn't owned by an individual. It's owned by everybody in the business,
Yes.
and people needing to take action there protects all involved. I mean, one of the additional challenges is, particularly manufacturing businesses, but also construction sites as well, is that
Yep.
there's lots of people who aren't working for their business
Yep.
coming into their business.
Yep.
So I'm thinking about subcontractors or external workers, or people that are uh, providing a service on site,
Yep.
maintaining a machine from a contractor or whatever the case may be. How important is it that they actually adhere to the safety standards that's established within that manufacturing business?
It's really important, and actually, I have dealt with a scenario where the my client had engaged an external engineer to come out and carry out sort of specialist maintenance work. So it wasn't their employee, and it was that individual who sadly ended up involved in a fatal accident. And really, the HSE in that situation were hyper focused on how did you choose this business? How did you choose the engineer, the company? What was your process for sort of vetting them to make sure? So it's almost like expecting something akin to a tender process to make sure that you have some sort of process there for checking that they have are compliant and that they have sufficient training and records, and so that's something that you have to look at. How do you select the people that you allow onto your site? When they arrive on site, you have to make sure that anyone who's new to site has been inducted to site, so you can't take for granted that they will familiarize themselves adequately. So there has to be an initial site induction, and then anyone who comes on site, as a minimum, you have to check, whether they have in the past or recent past carried out the site induction. And then any sort of work that they're going to do, it's not necessarily enough to just say, well, crack on. You do need to sort of ask, what is it you're going to do? What do you need from us? Do we need to isolate anything here? How do we work together to make sure that you can do your work safely? So it is important, absolutely. So it's worth giving some thought to that. Whether you have a process for selecting subcontractors or anyone externally, and what happens when they arrive on site. Are they inducted? Do you check that? Do you have a process for checking that? And do you walk through or discuss what's going to be done and what needs to happen in terms of your people or your infrastructure to make sure that they keep safe.
So in many respects, then, it's that anybody who arrives on your site should be assumed to have been in your responsibility, and as such, they need to take their responsibility seriously.
Yes,
Not just in terms of their own interest, but in the interest of others that may be on site there as well.
that's right.
And and obviously you mentioned there that not all accidents are fatal, thankfully.
Yeah.
Uh, but can a fatal accident or a very severe accident actually lead to potentially an employment tribunal? So there's that whole additional layer of litigation potentially that's involved. And if that is the
Yeah.
case, then what do businesses need to do to mitigate that risk?
Yeah. So in terms of the sort of, I mean, if you're talking about fatal accident, I mean, that sounds really, really dispassionate, but the death, extinguishes the employment contract. Um, it's again in a not sort of non-legalistic way. It's very important to think carefully about, how strictly you interpret that. Again, you're not legally obliged to pay to keep paying someone, but it's not a great look if you sort of stop paying them immediately, when you've family are left. So it's something that, you know, you might get legal advice that says, well, that's it, you're off the hook for you, but that's not necessarily the best thing to do. And it just, again, creates sets you off on the wrong path in terms of managing but the family, and then the various processes that will follow. But what can happen is that if you have a fatality and there's any suggestion that one of your other employees has had a role in that incident and has acted in a way that fell beneath what was required of them, then you need to seriously look at, having an exit process or considering that, having a proper investigation to decide whether, and look, that may well result in an unfair dismissal claim. And then there's a sort of, you need to balance up the risk of that against the, the benefit of having gone through that process carefully and with support, in terms of how that looks, if ultimately a court were to find that your employee caused the death by their actions, what has your response been to that? Have you kept them? That's a bit of a minefield, but yeah, it has to be carefully tread. But that can come up, but you're not going to get an employment claim from the deceased family, but it's more likely to be in that scenario where you have another employee involved.
And I mean, there's obviously the legal, but you're very clearly pointing to the moral
Yeah.
and the and even the morale with colleagues
Yep.
approach to this. People don't want bad will within the workplace, and it's important that people consider, which you did do in your opening number of slides, consider the totality of what
Yeah.
this incident actually means, including potential approaches from the press, etc., etc., etc. Well, quite obviously, one of the first things that people should do, should something go wrong, would be to seek really solid, strong, professional legal advice, and we would recommend people contact yourself, of course, for that. But if something happened today in the workplace,
Yeah.
what are the kind of first one or two things, as a reminder to people? What are the first one or two things that you think people really should be doing?
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, you get the slides afterwards, and there is a slide on sort of immediate aftermath. But first thing is to make sure everyone's safe. You're looking after your other people, make sure that, so get the emergency services there. But the very early, don't be afraid to look after the family and, talk to them and support them. Um, I think that's just the human thing to do. Don't shy away from that unnecessarily. But yeah, lift the phone, like, call, lift the phone as quickly as you can, and it doesn't matter when it is. It's these things can happen at any time. So, that's really that's key. But look, conscious it is a huge area, and I hope I've given a bit of a flavour and sort of caused you to start thinking about your own organisations and whether you're happy with where you are, whether you need a little bit more guidance or support. If anyone thinks of anything, please feel free to drop me an email. and I'll come back to you just as soon as I can.
And finally, just to kind of close off, if people took one action today, having watched the webinar, either live or in our recording, what's the one thing you think they should do today in order to get them into the right place should something go wrong?
I think the first, like, very, very quick action is the next meeting that you're in, whether it be a board meeting or a site meeting or whatever, just have someone in that meeting designated as the person who's thinking exclusively about health and safety, and just to see whether you can truly say that that's something that you are addressing and that it's, on the agenda. That's a really, it's like having, someone who's designated in meetings to be the sort of contrary person. have someone with a health and safety hat on, just as a starting point to see, how, is there something that we're missing here, or are we on top of this? So that would be my advice for a very easy, quick action.
And it costs nothing as well, but
Costs nothing.
the impact of that can be quite profound, I'd suggest.
Indeed.
Kirsten, thank you so much. As I
Not at all.
said, we will be sharing the slides, which has got very simple, practical, step-by-step route to making sure that well, firstly, hopefully that anything is avoided, but if something does go wrong, there's a systematic way in terms of protecting you and your business and your colleagues. We will share the recording later as well. If people do have a very specific question, we recommend that people email Kirsten. Its email address is on the screen as we speak. But thank you so much for delivering what is a really difficult subject for everybody involved in a nice, simple, systematic, and clear way for people. And hopefully people will find that of use. But thanks for joining us this afternoon, and we'll see you again. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.